We bought 3 Zizek books the first day.
Was that agreed upon beforehand? Like, right,
No.
we're in Slovenia.
It was just, we walked by a bookstore and I was like, well, obviously I'd like to go in and see if they have any Zizek in English. And they did. We got one book which was only his jokes.
Oh.
Like a compilation of jokes.
That is so niche.
I can go. Do you want one for the recording? I'll go get one.
Okay,
I do. I
good.
want a Zizek joke.
I want to be clear, though. I'm afraid. Like, anytime someone says the following phrase, a notable philosopher has written a book of jokes, there is a deep fear in me.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Because Language, a show about linguistics, the science of language. My name's Daniel Midgley. Let's meet the team. You know him. You love him. Well, maybe you don't love him. Love is a strong word. Let's just say you like him, but you don't like him like him. It's Ben Ainsley.
I would accept and be happy with unconditional positive regard.
A lack of antipathy.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I'll go so far to say that I like Ben.
Oh, hello. Don't leave that in. I will almost certainly get in trouble. Let's
wait,
edit
love
that
is actually better than like, because like
Yeah, exactly.
flirtier. I was thinking that like was between like and love, but you're right. Okay, no, I love Ben. That's better.
I do love Ben.
Platonically. Really
Yes.
platonically.
Yes, we should maybe reiterate for the listeners. Ben and I have never met in the flesh world.
I am secure enough in my masculinity to say this is a man that I care for dearly, and we've been doing this for so long that it's a feeling not entirely unlike love.
I am not at all comfortable enough in my own emotions to accept any of this praise. So,
Fair enough.
let's move on.
You know her. Well, how well do you know her? I mean, how well can we really know any other person? Charles Dickens once wrote that every human creature is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other. And if that's so, then perhaps we can seek solace in the fact that our minds are truly a private space, and while it's easy to lament our eagerness to blast open that private space on social media and say that it's merely for attention or for the approval of strangers, maybe instead it's part of a very human but ultimately tragically futile desire to be known, to be understood by any other human, a human like Hedwig Hurgard.
That was amazing. I love that. I feel like that. Yeah, that is the type of existential little rabbit hole that I fall in whenever I try and talk about intelligibility.
Yes.
It also sounded a lot like a Zizek joke.
Long and not very funny?
No.
Thank you both for coming here. It's great to see you again after a small break.
It has been cleansing.
So, on today's show, the first of a two-parter, a deep dive into the linguistic school of thought called generativism.
I hope our listeners, I hope their pencils are sharpened. I hope they have bought the appropriate textbook, because I'm confident in saying this is our most scholastic episodes ever.
I don't want to overthink this.
And I think that's, I don't know. Maybe our listeners can correct me, but
I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just, I like managing expectations. That is a thing that I think people in the world should do a lot more. And so I'm saying to my listeners, buckle up, because we've got some linguistics coming your way. Like linguistics with a capital L.
But we've tried to make it accessible, and I think people come to us for some of the deep dives into research. So I think this is something people would appreciate.
I think a good chunk of our listenership, I have just whetted their whistles quite thoroughly.
Yes.
Remember, our latest bonus episode was Journal Club with Hedwig and me and Steve. Yes, that's right. Stephen Mann joined us. You know him as the B guy, but you're going to know him as the Journal Club guy, because we all had a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was really nice.
And soon you may know him as his alter ego Esther Forte, but, You just have to stick around for that little juicy tidbit. It's coming soon. You should
definitely a tease?
It was a tease. It was a tease for a show coming up. I'm not very good at this. I'm very blunt, generally.
So if you want to make sure that you can listen to all of our bonus episodes, make sure you're a patron at the listener level. And there are different levels with different rewards. You can hang out with us on our Discord channel. There's merch. And of course, all patrons get our yearly mail out. We're going to work out our bonus package. It's going to be definitely a postcard and stickers, but maybe some other stuff too. So be a patron. That's patreon.com/becauselangpod.
Well, okay, what's going on in the news? We better get there eventually.
Let's see. People seem to come to us for slurs. When slurs are removed from product and place names, and I gladly take this up. Cheyenne and Chris on Facebook mentioned that a resort in Lake Tahoe that had a slur name, and they've changed it. So let's see. Lake Tahoe is in Nevada and in California in the USA. It's so big, it takes 2 states. And this story is about a resort on the California side of the lake. It used to have a derogatory name, which they're dumping. I'll just say the word once. It was known as Squaw Valley Alpine Meadows. And the first of those words is unacceptable, and I recommend dropping it from your lexicon.
I never had it in my lexicon.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, for people who are either under the age of, I'm going to say, about 55, which is, I think, how old you need to be to remember Westerns actually being popular instead of being like old people shows that are on late at night. So that's one group of people who probably had that word in their lexicon. And then the other group of people is just like, I guess, probably people from like the northern Midwest. And that's probably it. But I think do you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of akimbo, one of those funny little words that like just gets used in a really like small set of circumstances. Do you know what I mean?
You're just saying that it's a low frequency word that a certain group use, and you think that this word is similarly only used by a small amount of people.
Yeah, like a funny little fossil that like just kind of kept on going when a lot of its contemporaneous words had well and truly fallen away. Like I'm sure when this word was being regularly used like 100 and something years ago, you know, there was heaps and heaps of awful, awful words, and most of them have gone, but this nasty little one is like hung around like a virus.
Yeah. It's been used for hundreds of years by white people as a sexual slur to demean and dehumanize Native American women. They are changing the name. Oh, sorry, Hedwig?
No, I didn't know that this word meant, and I just learned what it meant, and I just went, oh, I see.
It is a derogatory word for Native American woman. That is the simplest I can get. And I've personally found in many of the places that I've traveled that there is a version of this for all sorts of different Indigenous peoples who have been horrifically colonized. We have one in Australia, which I'm not going to say, and I've come across several in many different places.
The new name of the resort is Palisades Tahoe, which is very nice. And Cheyenne says this has the double feature of a racist name being changed, as well as, this is the fun part, an explanation of Lake Tahoe being a tautological place name.
Oh, is this like the Tartar Pits?
The La Brea Tar Pits?
Yeah, the La Brea Tar Pits, which is really just like the Tar Pits.
Salsa sauce?
Yeah.
Salsa
Latte
sauce.
milk? Yeah.
Yeah, the name Tahoe comes from the Washoe word for lake, Dahao. So basically, when you say Lake Tahoe, you're saying Lake.
Oh, can I share my favorite tautological name with people?
Okay.
I saw it on TikTok.
To it.
Basically, there's a place somewhere in Wales that was like Hillberg Torpen, and each one of those different things all mean hill, and it was just like successive peoples just basically were like, what do you call that? And they're like, Tor, and they're like, all right, well, our word for hill is pen, so we're going to call it Torpen. And then the next people were like, Berg, and they're like, cool, we'll call it Torpenberg, and it just means hill.
I like that.
You're thinking of Torpenhow Hill.
Yes, that's right, Torpenhow Hill.
Hill.
Yeah.
The best I could do was Breeden Hill, which Bree was a hill, Don is a hill, and just successive waves of people forget what it meant, and so they just append their own things onto it. I love it.
But it's great news that this place in Tahoe has changed its name. I think that's really positive, and I'm glad that this momentum is keeping up.
Thanks to Cheyenne and Chris for that one. Who gave us this one?
Oh, I think I found it on Twitter. I love Twitter sometimes. I would highly recommend linguistics Twitter if you...
I thought you were about to be like, I would highly recommend anyone who hasn't heard of it. Check Twitter out.
No, but like a lot of people I know say that their Twitter feeds make them feel anxious or depressed in various ways. And I've found that linguistics Twitter overall doesn't make me feel anxious or depressed. And I've been keeping an eye out for some news for our news segment. And I found this interesting study by Joshua Conrad Jackson and colleagues. They're all from wildly different universities. So they're from Northwestern University in the United States. They're from University of North Carolina, University of Auckland, my institution here in Leipzig, and also University of Otago. So they've somehow met all of these lovely people, and they've done a study on how negative words mutate faster than positive words. So they've done one study on a big amount of cognates. So they've tried to recapitulate how fast different words mutate across time in the Indo-European language family, and they also did an online study. And lo and behold, I don't think anyone's surprised, there's a higher replacement rate for words with a negative connotation than with a positive.
Okay, so why would this be? Is that what I'm thinking of as the... I don't want to call it the euphemism treadmill, because that's a Steven Pinker thing. We got to find a different name for euphemism treadmill.
Okay,
because Steven Pinker won't be fully cancelled until we eradicate his terminology.
Are we cancelling all of his... Okay. This is... I don't know what to say, but like... The sweary to good transitory property.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. Dang, why can't I find my tweet on this? I'm going to have to... Dang it. I'll have to find it later.
So it looks like we're sticking with sweary to good transitory process.
Okay. So is that what's happening here? You have a word like gross or filthy, and eventually we get sick of it, and then we find something else?
Yeah, so we've got words like dirty, stab, and guts.
Mm-hmm.
Just quickly, because I think I've come up with a better one than the one I came up with before, which wouldn't be hard because it was terrible. Superlative. Is there a negative version of a superlative? Do we have a word for that? Or can superlatives be positive and negative?
Superlative just means the extreme version of when you say like good, better, best.
The most thing.
So
right?
bad, worst is also superlative. The worst is also superlative. It just means the most extreme.
Okay, so in that case, I would call, for this property, superlative entropy.
Oh my God, that is pretty... impenetrable, Ben. What does that mean?
What do you mean? I feel like that's super self-explanatory. Right?
No,
the idea that,
you used the word entropy.
Yeah, exactly.
I need help.
Okay, so like entropy, right, is this notion that like everything eventually stops, right?
Everything winds down and never winds up.
Everything winds down, everything slows down, everything gets cooler, everything just eventually, on a long enough timeline, is going to stop. So superlative entropy is this idea that no matter how like intensely something is, eventually moron, which was like the, like a really intense word, just becomes nothing.
So why is this happening? Is it that
moving on,
positive words are normal and then the negative words are a takeoff on that, so they can deviate lots? What's the mechanism here?
I just feel like, as a layperson, my non-linguistic explanation is that when you're pissed off, you want to just like... It's a little bit like a linguistic version of like chucking a tantrum, right? You don't want to just sit there and calmly explain in simple language, I feel that a thing has happened that is bad, right? You want to chuck your toys out of the cot. You want to just like linguistically kind of stomp around and throw some things. And so you need a whole bunch of words to do it. You're like, this son of a motherfucker's God, you fucking bitch. You know what I mean?
That's so funny, Ben. It's such an Australian response, I think, because I'm reading here in the paper that because they did this study where individuals got to replace words, and they were more likely to replace the words of negative concepts. And many of them themselves said that they found the words unpleasant and wanted to replace them because they thought they were unpleasant. So that is
not
at all in line with my experience.
Yeah, but taboo replacement is totally a thing. We know that that's a motivator for words getting turfed out of the language. Even unrelated words, like, when fuck came into vogue, other words that sounded like fuck, like fug and feck and fax. Not facts that we know, but other words. People stopped using them and we no longer see them. So this could be a case of taboo avoidance motivating the lexicon.
It could. They do also mention, it's funny in here in the paper, they also say that they found that there's been studies that show that people transmit positive words with higher fidelity than negative words. And I think transmit here means to the next generation. But then they also say that there's another study showing that people transmit negative information with higher fidelity than positive information. So it's a little bit unclear. But all this paper can say for now, at least, is that they found through two different methods, the tracing cognates back in time and individuals doing this online game kind of thing, that people do replace negative words at a larger frequency. Why it seems to be maybe a bit harder to explain. If you have a good idea, why don't you tell us? Because at least one of these people is a colleague of mine.
Because we're dry.
And I could tell them your clever thoughts. It's also a paper that is up. It's open access. It's up as a preprint, so anyone can read it. We can put it in the show notes.
Woohoo!
Wow.
Woohoo.
All right.
Free academia. Everyone's favorite.
All right, what's next, Hedvig? You've got one.
Next up is a paper from some researchers from Zurich and colleagues. This is Ranacher et al. Or I've been corrected. It's an Austrian name, Ranacher, I think is the correct pronunciation. So do you know what linguistic areas are?
The areas where languages happen to be, like the actual geographic map of languages.
Oh, that's a very good point, because that's a language area and a linguistic area is a different thing. Oh no.
Okay, this is important. This is good. The dummy non-linguist has stumbled into the briar patch, and now you two need to take my hand and extract me.
No, I can't, because what is this? Is it like how some languages
Hedvig needs to take both of our hands and extract both of us.
Okay, so I know that languages sometimes resemble each other in ways because of inheritance. They're related genetically.
Yes.
Sometimes it's because there are things that are more or less intuitive, like onomatopoeia.
Yes.
But then there are also aerial features where languages will be in contact and they'll resemble each other because they're just near each other, even if they're not related. Is that a linguistic area?
Yes, that's where we're getting. Good job. Pew, pew,
Yes.
pew.
Thank
So
you.
a language area is the area where a language is spoken. So, for example, I'm in Germany. The language area of Germany covers Germany and some parts of some neighboring countries a little bit. And you can see maps of this. The most famous ones are made by Ethnologue, and you can see these beautiful maps with what's known as polygons. So they're sort of blobs that sometimes follow nation boundaries, but very often don't at all.
So that's a language map, but that's not what we're talking about. We're
Yes.
talking about a linguistic map.
So particularly in the field of linguistic typology, people have been looking for linguistic areas. And these are areas where people say, just like how there are families for shared inheritance, maybe there are areas for particularly large amounts of shared horizontal transmission. So when you borrow from your neighbor, that's a linguistic area. One of the definitions of it is, say you have an area and you have different languages in there and they come from different language families. So far, so good?
Yeah,
And
I got a bunch of languages. They're not related, but they're near each other.
They're near each other. And they have relatives that are related to them that are further away, that are not inside the area. Right?
Good so far.
Good so far? And then within this area, they share certain features. Maybe their pronouns look a bit similar, or they share a bunch of vocabulary items, or they all have this super quirky phoneme that no one else has.
Because they've started to talk like each other.
Yes.
Or sign like each other.
And they started to talk, and we can tell that they're starting to talk like each other because this isn't a trait that their relatives, their cousins outside of the area have.
Oh, they left the other people in the other areas behind.
Yes.
I think I've understood this. Can I give you an example, Hedvig, and you tell me if I've got the right example? And I think this might help listeners who are still a bit confused. So, my very limited understanding of linguistic family trees, linguistic genealogy, is that the Basque language,
Yes.
is an isolate. It's unrelated to stuff around it from a linguistic point of view. Yep. So it has nothing to do linguistically with French, and it has nothing to do linguistically with Spanish, the two languages that are directly around it. However, in that particular part of Spain, the Basque region and France, you would possibly find that the Spanish and French speakers would have a few quirky little bits and pieces that are also features of Basque, but that aren't features of French or Spanish.
Yes, so I can't, I should say, I don't know if that's true. That's a good example.
Yeah. Like
I don't know if that's true, but that would be an example.
If that was true, that would be
perfect.
a linguistic area.
Yes, that exactly.
I'm just upset that you're neglecting the Basque Korean connection here, which clearly those two were.
Isn't this like an old hokey, like Basque is actually secretly related to Korean, but everyone's like, no, it's not. Shut up.
Don't even start me on Klingon.
And I also think there's a...
I won't start you on Klingon.
Funny thing about Basque, I think there's a Basque Icelandic pigeon. But
wow.
Never mind.
Okay, yes. Listen, now I'm going to be the person who grabs both of your hands and drags you out of the linguistic, kooky briar patch.
Save me.
This paper by Ranacher et al. Have devised a new method of finding these linguistic areas. So traditionally, these areas have been found by qualitatively, manually saying, I found a feature. I think this is an area. And sometimes people have said one trait is enough to establish an area. Sometimes people have said, no, there needs to be more. People disagree on this and that and blah, 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 blah. And they found a new cool way of taking a bunch of data, in this case, mainly grammatical data about languages and other structural data, and run this cool clustering algorithm that tries to find significant clusters that aren't explained by shared inheritance or universal preference. So precisely what Daniel said at the beginning. So to do this, they used some data on languages in the Balkans and in the South America, and they found some areas that correspond to known areas of more contact. So their method are spitting out areas that seem to make sense. And it's really cool. And I should say, for full disclosure, that it's so cool that I'm actually involved in a research project with these people on applying this method on another data set. So I'm... Nifty. It is nifty, and I'm very excited about it. I think this is a new example of this wave that's been happening in linguistics over the past 10 years, where people are saying, oh, these concepts that people were working on qualitatively, manually, crafting together, maybe we can automize and do this in a more large scale and more, honestly, objective way. Computers don't know anything more than what we tell them, so they're not likely to have biases. So they have
all of our biases, is what you're saying.
Well, true.
That was funny because we just ended on exactly the different notes. They don't have the unknown biases, at least. Yeah. True. So this is yet another example of how to sort of automize and objectify traditional linguistic methodology. So linguistic errors is a traditional thing that people have been making, but this is a new way of doing it. That's really cool.
So I got two questions. What will this help you to do?
It will help you find linguistic areas. Okay.
And that's good because we don't want to think that something is inheritance or universal tendency. We want to be able to tease those apart and say, these resemble each other, but not because of inheritance. It's contact.
Yes, that's one of the reasons. And also just for knowing things about migration and history, maybe if we apply this to an area where we don't know as much about the history. So in the South American case and in the Balkan case, people know about some of the history between these communities. But if we apply it to a new place, we could learn new things about the history of those communities that we didn't know before. So we could find clusters that were unknown. And then we could look into those. So sort of explorative. And then you can look in and try and find out, okay, these are clustering together. And when you look, you might find something interesting about their history.
The other thing I wanted to know is they used grammatical features. Was there a good reason to do that? I mean, I thought you could use words, but is that a bad idea?
No, you can use words. We're actually going to be using some lexical items. It's just that most sets of list of words are basic vocabulary, so they're super duper inherited.
So that kind of mucks it up. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hey, well, congratulations on working with the team. That's going to be really cool, and we'll be interested to see what comes out of it.
Yeah, I'm excited.
SpawnCon alert. Give us 37 seconds. Boop. Are you a language nerd? Maybe you love a good anagram or crossword puzzle. Well, have we got the podcast for you? Slate's Spectacular Vernacular is a new podcast that explores language and plays with it.
It's hosted by Nicole Holliday, a linguistics professor of the University of Pennsylvania and a frequent guest on this show, and Ben Zimmer, a language columnist for the Wall Street Journal.
It's out every other week, and it brings you the latest news from the language world and offers you the chance to flex your own linguistic skills with some wordplay and maybe even win a prize.
Check out Spectacular Vernacular, new episodes every other Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. This episode is about generativism, a school of linguistic thought that has been championed by Noam Chomsky and many other great linguists. Let me just start by saying that when I first got into linguistics, it was like walking into a room where there had been a huge fight. And everybody wants to tell you what the fight was about and who did what, and you try to follow along, but there are a few things that are problematic. One is that everyone's super, super angry about the fight. And number two, the fight is about stuff that's really hard to understand. So you kind of go along and you try to understand and kind of try to join in to this discussion. I don't want to say it's a fight, but there have been, battles. I think
it's a fight.
Okay. I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah.
Am I getting this right, Hedvig?
I think definitely I felt very much the same way. And I also found that there's a lot of linguistics out there that has nothing to do with this fight, actually. And it depends a bit on where you do your undergraduate degree, how you were introduced to this fight. I think if you do it in Australia or United States or somewhere in Europe, you're going to get quite different impressions.
I mean, my professor, John Robertson, was definitely an anti-Chomsky.
Right.
There were Chomskyan linguists in the department.
What was your one, Hedvig? What side of the what would the West Side Story, the Jets and the Sharks?
Yeah, exactly.
I definitely grew up in a very functionalist department,
which is non-Chomsky.
Yes.
Non-Chomsky.
But I'm contrarian, so when I was told,
don't do this thing,
I was like,
you got your little Chomsky book and you put on a cardigan and you were like, oh, watch me.
I definitely was more intrigued than maybe some other. I still am not a generativist, I should say. Definitely not. But the sort of the thing that was people were trying to inject into me, which I felt was quite this fight, this anger. I was quite what's it called? Reticent. There we go. That word. Yeah. Which is one of the reasons I was so happy when you guys agreed to do these two shows. So we have two shows, How It Started and How It's Going. And today we are at the How It Started show.
We had a bit of a chat recently with two linguists in the generative tradition, towering giants in the field. One is Professor David Adger at Queen Mary University of London. He's the author of Language Unlimited, The Science Behind Our Most Creative Power. We also had a chat with John Goldsmith, a professor of linguistics at the University of Chicago. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author of Battle in the Mind Fields with Bernard Lax. So there are going to be a few concepts that are going to come up here, like a grammar and making a grammar that generates things. And also nativism, the idea that at least some language knowledge is innate. We're also going to be talking about the relationship between generativism and functionalism, which, Hedvig, could you give me a fairly good definition of what a functionalist thinks?
I actually think that it's hard to describe generativism as a monolith, and it's even harder to describe functionalists. But roughly you could say that one of the core areas of conflict is that functionalists believe that the main function of language is to communicate and that things stem. Part of what language looks like comes from the social interaction, the pragmatic sort of interaction between people and information transfer, whereas generativists aren't as enthused by that function of language. I would say that that's one of the reasons why it's called functionalism.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, at least you're concerned with the functions of language, how it's used, versus a generativist who might be more concerned with language in the mind.
Yes.
I feel like if you've got a grip on those concepts, then you're ready to absorb this discussion that we had with David Adger and with John Goldsmith.
I did warn them. at the start of the show. I hope your pencils are sharpened. This one's not for slouches. Come on, let's do it.
John, I'd like to ask you about what's become known as the Chomskyan Revolution. What were you doing at the time?
I was a student at MIT in what you might call the second generation of students. I was there from 72 to 76, and I worked closely with Morris Halley and to some degree with Noam Chomsky and Paul Kiparsky and Hadge Ross, and it was a really wonderful time to be in grad school, and I enjoyed it very much. I mean, in retrospect, there's a lot of things I would have done differently if I had been in charge, but the fact is, for me, it was a great education and a wonderful experience.
Wow. Heady days.
Yeah.
What was so different about generativism? What were the goals of this new movement?
It didn't feel new at that point. It felt, so since I started there in 72, that means I applied to grad school a year later, and I was in college at that point. And it already seemed like Chomsky was the dominant force on the scene, and as if there really wasn't much else. I now know that that's really wrong. It reminds me often of how in the Bible it talks about Cain and Abel going out to marry somebody in a neighboring community. And of course, there couldn't have been any other people there on the scene. And that's how it was in linguistics. It seemed like there was Chomsky and MIT and generative grammarians, and there wasn't anything else, although the journals had been, they had been publishing for 40, 50 years. Anyway, by the time I got to MIT, Chomsky was working primarily on syntax at that point. And in the 50s, when he got started, he worked on lots of areas. He worked on phonology, he worked on mathematical linguistics, and he said later that he decided he had to give up phonology and mathematical linguistics because he wanted to do politics as well. And so that's an important part of the answer, I think, to your question, that Chomsky was doing politics. And I think all of us saw that side of him as an important part, as a defining part of who he was. I certainly felt that way, even though I probably didn't articulate it very much. But I first became aware of Noam Chomsky as a person, as an intellectual, in 1969. I saw him give a talk at Cornell University on the responsibility of intellectuals. And it was very impressive, and he articulated a lot of thoughts that I had that I'd never been able to put into words. And so coming to MIT was coming to work both with somebody who seemed like the center of everything linguistics, but also an important public intellectual. I'll tell you an anecdote. I remember the very first class that I went to at MIT, so this is the fall of 72, and there was a reason. So this was Chomsky's class, I should say. Mm-hmm. And it was a reasonable sized room, maybe 45, 50 seats there. But there were, many more people than that. People were standing by the windows and sitting down. And I had gotten there early, as I usually do, like I did this morning, and sat down in one of the chairs in the front seat. I didn't know anybody around me. And then at some point, right on time, Chomsky walked into the room, and he comes up to the person who is sitting next to me, and Noam says hi, and Neil, I later found out it was, Wayne O'Neill. Wayne says, hi, Noam, do you understand what's going on in Vietnam now? And Noam says, yeah, I think I do. And Wayne says, well, you got to tell me about it. And then Chomsky walked up to the front of the room and started talking. So it seemed like a very fitting way for the class to begin. Wow. Anyway, that's a bit of what MIT felt like at the time.
David, what's your view? How was generativism different from what came before?
My understanding is that basically Chomsky arrived on the scene where there were fundamentally the approach to language was deeply surfacey. It was very behavioristic. So you looked at just the language you recorded in fieldwork sessions, and then you took that as the primary data. And what you did is you applied various processes to it to determine what the phonemes were. Once you had the phonemes, you looked at sequences of phonemes, and built up morphemes, which are like, things like dog or z to give you dogs. And then on top of that, then you built up grammatical categories, things like nouns and verbs, by looking at how the morphemes distributed in the sentences you'd recorded, and so on. So it was very kind of, the whole focus was on external behavior and systems or processes which you could apply to that external behavior and which would give you an analysis of the language. So the idea was you should have some kind of mechanism whereby you just apply it to the data and boof, out what you get is a grammar of the language, and that gives you an understanding of that language. And basically, Chomsky came along with a kind of very different point of view. He made a bunch of arguments that approach was just never going to work. So the argument really was, the core argument, I think, was more or less, look, in no science do you have something where you just look at the data and then apply a procedure to whatever data you've collected and get a theory. That just doesn't happen in the sciences. And what he said is, that shouldn't really happen in linguistics either. What we need to do is we need to build a good theory that explains the data. So what you're trying to do is not just take the data initially and then extract something, extract something from that. What you're really, in a sense, doing is saying there's something else going on which gives rise to that data, something which produces the data, something which, if you like, generates that data. And of course, since that data is never ending, that is, there's no kind of in principle longest sentence in a language. Whatever generates or produces that data, whatever system gives you that has to be a system that is essentially going to give you an unbounded number of sentences. So that's what Chomsky did. He came in and he said, you guys are doing all this wrong. We need to be a bit more like the real sciences and actually build a theory, and that theory will generate the data from us, rather than looking at the data and applying some processes to derive a theory. So I think that was the big idea.
So this reminds me of physics, how, like, if I want to know how long it's going to take a ball of a certain size to fall from a certain building height, I can drop the ball a bunch of times and I'll get observations, that are kind of accurate, kind of not accurate, because my stopwatch isn't very good, or it's only so good. And what a mathematician would say is, no, I've got an equation that'll tell you exactly how long it'll take under ideal conditions. Your observations are just deviations from my equation. So what Chomsky's doing is he's saying, let's work on the equation.
That's kind of spot on, I think. I mean, like, it's a very particular kind of equation because, as I said earlier on, for human language and specifically for syntax, for the grammar of human languages, there's an unbounded number of sentences that we can have, right? And we just use those sentences as we feel like. We just kind of generate them on the fly, right? And so, what you've got to somehow do is not just write the equation, but that equation has to be a certain kind of equation. It has to be an equation which gives you an infinite set of outcomes, right? And that's kind of interesting because we human beings are not infinite in any sense, right? So we're finite creatures. And so the big thing then is, like, how do you get that unbounded output from a finite creature? And Chomsky appealed to a particular kind of mathematics whose job is specifically kind of to do that. So, and that was the theory of computability, what was at the time called recursive function theory, which sounds terrifying, but basically it's kind of the basis of how most computing systems work, right? It just basically says you've got a set of primitives, of things that you can't break down any further, and a set of ways of putting those primitives together, and you can use your maths to have a finite set of primitives, a finite number of ways of combining them to give an infinite or unbounded set of outputs. And Chomsky was arguing that's the way to think about this, specifically the syntax of human languages. So you don't just look at the data and kind of extract from it the patterns. What you do is you say, no, there's an underlying system that, even though we're finite, will generate an infinite number of patterns.
Chomsky had a couple of things to offer the field that were really quite new. And the first basically was to say that we can think about a grammar as a mathematical, or the term I'd like to use is an algebraic object. If I use the word algebraic, it isn't going to mean a whole lot to most people. And I think probably a simpler and probably a better way to put it is writing a computer program. So what Chomsky did was he said, first of all, our task is no longer going to be, as everybody had assumed up to this point, our task is no longer to be able to analyze any sentence that comes from a given language. Our task is going to be to write a computer program that generates all the grammatical sentences and none of the ungrammatical sentences. And so those are two big ideas. They don't sound big the way I've put them just now, but they really were. So what were the two? The first was saying that what a linguist is trying to do is to write a computer program. Up to that point, really, nobody knew programming. There barely was such a thing as computer programming. And so linguists had taken their task to be, well, I want to analyze English or Swahili, and that means if you give me a sentence of it, I can break it down into the pieces and tell you how the pieces fit together. And Chomsky turned that around. He saw there were a lot of difficulties that linguists were facing when they posed the question that way. And he said, no, let's think about it a different way. Let's generate the sentences, which essentially is where the word generative comes from. But then he said a second thing, which over the last 50 years has just sounded like something completely normal. And that is the goal of the linguist is to separate the grammatical from the ungrammatical sentences, from the good from the bad, you might say. And if that sounds perfectly natural to you, it's only because Chomsky has said so.
David, I want to ask you about universal grammar and how it relates to this question of what a language can be. How do you think of universal grammar, and how might this be different from what functionalists think?
I think that the way that I think about this, at least, is that universal grammar, which is the notion that generativists generally believe in, right? Believe is just a rubbish word, but hypothesize, is intended essentially as an envelope that says what language will not be like. Okay? So, and then within that, there can be all sorts of functionalist, communicative stuff that actually makes languages change in the way they do. I mean, I've done quite a bit of work on sociolinguistics and how it interacts with generative grammar. And I think, at certain periods during an individual's lifespan, their grammars are, maybe their whole lifespan, right? Their grammars can be really pretty variable. And then that variability can be taken advantage of by the group, in a sense. You might think, ooh, that's a cool way of saying this. I mean, you don't think that, but right, that's how your cognitive systems might end up. And then everyone starts drifting towards that. So, grammars themselves have to have a space in them for variability. But the crucial point, I think, is that from a generative perspective anyway, what happens is grammars, they create an envelope within which all of that variability takes place, right? And there may be even further restrictions on that. So, there might be formal restrictions on that. So the whole idea behind the principles and parameters approach was that actually not only are some things ruled out, but when a language does one thing, it's going to do a bunch of other things as well.
I mean, syntax is really cool, but there's a lot of other stuff in linguistics like phonology, morphology, sociolinguistics,
neuro,
semantics, child language acquisition. Do you get a sense of why Chomsky thought that syntax was really the place that it was most properly the concern of linguists?
Yeah, actually, I'd like to give two responses to that. They're quite different. The first is that you've pointed to some areas like sociolinguistics, which were in a sense wiped off the map by some of the decisions that Chomsky made. I gave you a partial answer a second ago, and I talked about some of the new things that Chomsky said. But in the 60s, he took a step forward, which he hadn't before, and that was to come up with, or to propose and to defend, a theory of mind that he thought would be appropriate for language-using people like us as humans. And he thought of it as Cartesian, he thought of it as rationalist. But most importantly, he didn't think of it as social. He didn't think of there being anything like social knowledge or culture or anything of the sort. In a certain sense, he really was he is a Cartesian in the sense that all that matters is a single individual mind. And that, again, was very new for linguistics, because linguistics in the United States was really rooted in, well, three approaches. The first was good old historical linguistics, people who studied Greek and Latin and Sanskrit and all those languages, which served as an important part of linguistics, especially in the 19th century. But there was also sociology and anthropology, and they were studying language, and they are studying language, as a social phenomenon. Chomsky was not interested in that in any way, and left no room for it in his model of what's going on. For Chomsky, there's only individuals and species. If you want to study the species, you study universal grammar. If you want to study individuals, you can try to figure out their grammar. But there's no room there for people, and so there's no room for sociolinguistics. And that really means that over the last 50 years, there's been a kind of an undeclared war, maybe that's too strong a word, between people doing Chomskyan linguistics and people doing, let's say, Lebovian linguistics, for lack of a better word, sociolinguistics, and Leboeuf has been the major mover in that way.
Is it right to think about that there were a movement of scholars in linguistics, of Chomsky being one of them, that thought that the point of language was to do with sorting and thinking and doing things inside your head, your internal monologue and your cognitive processes, and that the social communication between individuals was sort of like a secondary point. Is that to characterize it correctly, or is that...
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Right, because that's...
I think if Chomsky were forced to respond to that, he would say, yeah, that's what I think. But I think that they didn't even really leave a secondary role for communication. When I say they, again, I'm speaking of the kind of the core Chomskyan project. It's mind, and not in a social context, not in a context in which one person is interacting with another.
And I remember how he even said that, I wouldn't say that language is for communication. You can certainly, do that with language, but you can do it with a haircut.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
That's the saussure that was picked up by the French. Yes, that anything can be a symbolic system, including how you cut your hair or the car that you buy. Yeah. You asked another question, or you asked a question. I only gave half an answer to it. So let me
go ahead.
Yes,
sort of answer the other half. And that was, why did Chomsky choose syntax to keep working on, and not phonology and not mathematical linguistics? I think the answer probably is that he, like everybody else, realized that his contribution in syntax was really unique and important. In the 1950s, linguists around him, people like Zelig Harris, his teacher, or Kenneth Pike, or Charles Hockett, they were trying to develop ideas that their teachers, like Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield, had developed. And everybody recognized that syntax was the next frontier, so to speak. And people had ideas how to move forward with it, but they knew that they were only scratching the surface. And when Chomsky came along in 1957 with syntactic structures and other things that he published just after that, people stood up and they looked and they said, wow, this is fantastic. This is really what we've been waiting for. And I think that's the answer, that he really had new ideas that not only did he think that they were interesting and revolutionary, other people did too.
We've talked about language and children, because children have human brains. Mm-hmm. They acquire a language eventually. Yep. And so one term that comes up in connection with generativism is nativism, the idea that some aspects of language are inborn, or that language is part of our genetic human inheritance, or even in some cases that there are specific structures that humans are born with. How much of that am I getting right? And what's the relationship between generativism and nativism in your view?
So I try to generally avoid the word innate when I'm talking about these things, or nativism or those kinds of words.
Oh.
Partly because I mean, everyone thinks there's a ton of innate stuff in the mind, right? I mean, there is no one these days who thinks we're born with a blank slate. So the question is not so much what is innate, it's what is specific to language, okay? So then there's a deeper, not deeper, then there's a more specific question to that, which is what we mean by language. There's a ton of stuff that's innate in people's minds, like capacities to extract patterns and follow frequencies and all that kind of stuff. Everyone agrees that.
Okay.
And then there's the question of what is specific to language, where we understand language as grammar in this particular case, right? That is what's specific to grammar. And then that's a question. And there could be nothing specific to grammar, okay? In which case you would essentially be within the more functionalist lines, and you would say all the stuff, all the generalizations that typologists and linguists make about grammar, they are all an effect of other kinds of properties of the brain that have nothing to do with language, right? I mean, they may have to do with processing or pattern extraction or frequency or whatever, and they all have something to do with language from that perspective, but there's nothing that is unique, that is specific to language and unique to language. In the generative perspective, the argument is there is something specific and unique to language, okay? That's what we call UG, okay? And then what is that? And the arguments for that are generally these poverty of stimulus type arguments. So that would be whatever the primitives of that knowledge are, that's what's specific to language.
I've heard it expressed that children are good at doing certain language things even though they never hear input like that.
Yeah, that's poverty of stimulus, basically. Yeah.
Do you think that's true?
I do. Yeah. So, I mean, we don't even need to go to children. We can go to adults, right? I mean, so there are very complex things, very complex pieces of knowledge about grammar that you can test experimentally that humans in general seem to have that is not in their input.
The example that I always hear is the man is singing, the man is tall. Is the man who is singing tall? I always say that, and I never say, is the man who's singing is tall? Yeah. I could say that, but I never do. Yeah. And adults and children never say that either. They always do it the way that sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic example of, and there have been many attempts to try and make that work through non-language specific means, and I don't really know how to evaluate them at this point. I mean, maybe some work, maybe some don't. I have another example which I quite like, which might appeal to people who do typology as well. So that's an example I stuck in. It's in one of the chapters of this Language Unlimited book of mine, which is about possessors in languages like English or German or whatever. So you say, David's cat, right? You could also say David's cat's tail. You can say Anson's partner's cat's tail. You can say Anson's neighbor's partner's friend's cat's tail, and so on, right? So actually what you end up with is you end up with being able, you kind of lose track of who's doing what to whom, or who's owning whom, I guess. But you can kind of repeat this at will, right? There's a pattern there. And you can give that pattern a meaning. It clearly has a meaning, although, your semantic systems might get bored after a while. Now, it's really interesting. If you look at languages of the world, there are some languages which have this kind of syntax in them, like English and Scottish Gaelic and Mandarin and so on. And there are some languages which have been reported to only allow one possessor. So you can say David's cat, but you can't say David's friend's cat. Okay? So those are languages like Standard German has been argued to be like that. And Dan Everett's work on Piraha has argued that Piraha is like that as well. Not so many languages like that, but people have argued the same thing.
It's good for me to know about Standard German. It's what I'm trying to learn at the moment. So.
I mean, Dutch has been claimed to be like this as well, but as far as I did some work on Dutch, and it doesn't quite look like that. And so there's a really interesting question there, right? We know that babies are able to discern things automatically which are in very small numbers, right? Groups of 2 or groups of 3, compared to larger groups like 5. They can't look at that and go, oh, that's 5, right? What they do is they cut it into two groups, a 3 and a 2. So this is a kind of general non-language specific capacity called subitization. Actually, crows can do it. All sorts of animals can do this. You can determine the number of things in a very small group, and you can also determine the relative sizes of large groups. So that's another kind of skill that seems to be innate, but not language specific. Now, here's an interesting question. We don't know of any languages that restrict the number of possessives to 2. This would be a language where you could say David's cat, David's friend's cat, but not David's friend's cat's tail. Okay? Friend's cat's tail.
So you either cut at
so we don't know of any language
or infinite. Or very large.
Yeah, very large. I mean, probably not infinite because you'll die, but yes. So then there's a really interesting question about why that typological generalization holds. And further, if you look at language like English, which do allow multiple possessors, and you look at the input to children from their caregivers. So Avery Andrews has done this by looking at the Childes database, which is for English, which is you guys maybe know about.
Love it.
And what he found is basically in that you get a lot of single possessors, a small number of two possessors, and a tiny number. Actually, no, that's it. I think there might be some cases of John's baby's mother's name. I think there might be a bunch. There might be some with 3, but they all involve like just basically the word name as the noun. And I think there's 82 examples or something like that. Okay, so here's a question for both the typologists and the language acquisition people, right? Which is why, given that the input to the kids is only 2, very rarely 3, why do kids learn to do it with 4 or 5? Say, why? How do kids go from finite data, in fact, highly restricted finite data, to an infinite set of possibilities? And equally, why do languages never end up with just 2, right? Since that's what kids hear.
Yeah, why?
Yeah, why? So,
I thought you were going to tell us.
Well, I mean, I can tell you why from a generative perspective, but I think that this is a really interesting poverty of stimulus type case, right? Because we know what the stimulus is. We know it's poor. We should expect, therefore, to find languages, some language somewhere where you can say David's friend's cat, but not David's friend's cat's tail, right? We know that there is extra linguistic capacity, innate subitization skills where you can determine 2 things. We know that kids can learn sequences, right? They learn 1, 2, 3 quite happily. They learn, I mean, there's all the old work of psychologists that show that sequence learning, they can sequence different sized blocks very early on, and so on. So there's an interesting question about what would rule that out. So, I've given you, it was Daniel that picked up the one about singing and talking to or whatever.
The man who was singing is tall. Yeah.
I mean, that's an example that Chomsky came up with in the 60s. It's in Language and Mind, I believe. But there's, I was going to say an infinite amount. There probably is an infinite amount. But there's an enormous amount of similar kinds of cases all around us if we just look. And then what functionalists end up having to do is appeal to something else that will then explain why the syntax of possessive recursion is as restricted as it is. So, I asked Adele Goldberg about this and she said, yeah, it's the semantics. The semantics restricts it in some fashion. And actually, Stefan Muller, who's an HPSG person, has also suggested the same. But without a theory of what the semantics is of this, I don't even know what that means, right? There's absolutely no sense in which I can't have a flat semantics for this, right? There is something and David owns that something and that something is a cat and so on, right? The cat and there is something else and something else is a tail and the cat has the tail and so on. This is a very flat semantics. In fact, that would be the normal, predicate logic semantics for something like this. And it's flat. I don't know why you should expect to get a recursive structure in the syntax, a structure with a noun phrase embedded inside another one. So, you can maybe try and say that it's because of other stuff, but I think those are the kinds of interesting challenge for functional accounts that need to be dealt with.
John, I'd like to ask you, what aspects of language do you think might be innate?
I think it's too early in the development of our scientific knowledge about language to have anything other than an opinion. And everybody has an opinion, or maybe several opinions. And those opinions influence what we do. But I don't think we're at a point where we have any real scientific knowledge as to what's innate. Let me put it a slightly different way. Chomsky and people following Chomsky used to like to point to the empiricists in the 17th and 18th century philosophers like David Hume and before him John Locke. And they used to like to point to them and say, those are the empiricists. And they famously said, there's nothing in the mind that doesn't get there through the senses. Everything in your mind originally came in, if it's language, through your ears. And they like to say that even in the 20th century, that was a fitting way to describe what the predecessors to generative grammar were doing. I don't think that's right. I don't think anybody could be an empiricist anymore in the way that people back in the halcyon days of empiricism in the 17th and 18th century. Nobody's an empiricist that way. And certainly if you've thought a bit about learning, anybody who's thought about learning realizes that learning is done based on the architecture, the hardware, however you want to put it, of the device that's learning. So actually now, let me break into what I do. For the last, 20 years, I've been working on developing a computer program that breaks words down into pieces. And if you have a word like transformations, you can break that down into a word transformation, and it's got an S on the end. And you've got inside that transform and a suffix ation and so forth. So we know all those things as speakers of English, but how did we learn it? And I've been working on a program that does that, not for English, but for any language. That's the goal. You put in a text in any language and out come those pieces of the word. And it's great fun, I have to say. It's really great fun to put in a language that I've never worked on and see what comes out and see what it gets right, what it gets wrong. But to do that, I have to make assumptions about what capabilities I want to give to the program. And the only thing that makes what I'm doing different from what anybody else is doing is that I'm doing it with a computer program rather than, so to speak, thinking it through in my head without a computer. So everybody makes assumptions as to what's built in. Some people think that if psychology, for example, or neurobiology points to something as being present in the human brain, that the smart money should go with that for language also. I actually don't feel that way. I don't think Chomsky feels that way either. I don't look to psychology or neurobiology for inspiration as to what might be, or well, let's just say what might be native. But I certainly have respect for people who do, and I'm sure I'm in a small minority in that way.
Well, it sounds like we're really talking about two different things when we talk about generativism versus nativism. They touch and they have a long history of traveling together, but they're not really the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You can be a generativist without being a nativist. And in some ways, I think Chomsky's come around to that, and I'll say why in a second. And you can certainly be a nativist without being a generativist. So a nativist ultimately is somebody who says, here's what we have to begin the learning process with. I have to assume that the hardware is the following. But if they say, I'm not interested in separating the grammatical from the ungrammatical, as I say, computational linguists, anybody working for Microsoft and doing computational linguists is not interested in separating the two. And then really by definition, they're not generative grammarians. So you absolutely can be a nativist without being a generativist. And I would say the early Chomsky was a generativist without being a nativist. And so why am I saying that he's come around to that now? Over the last 10 years, he has said some things to support the idea that possibly the only thing you need to know, only thing you need to have access to is some very abstract notion of simplicity, some computational notion of simplicity. And that's an idea I've been very comfortable with the last maybe 20 years. If you can define a notion of simplicity that really is mathematical, doesn't depend on anything in this finite world that we live in, then you're not a nativist. You're really only appealing to kind of Platonic notions of what makes one analysis better than another. And so there's no question in my mind. I think the right answer to your question is, yeah, nativism and generativism are logically independent.
We've talked about functionalism and generativism, but I feel like I really want to focus on what they are. We've talked about what generativism is, but what is functionalism and how do the goals of functionalism differ?
I don't really think that the term functionalism describes a single thing, a coherent object. I tend to think that anybody who focuses on grammar but distances themselves from generativism is viewed as a functionalist, but I think there are many different ways to do that. Or to maybe put it slightly differently, if a person's work doesn't naturally fall into some well-known category, let's say like sociolinguistics or Chomsky linguistics, that functionalism is sort of a category of last resort.
Like a trash bin category.
Well, I wasn't going to use a metaphor like that, but you could say that. You could also just say default category or whatever. It's just a way
of... Default's better, you're right.
It's just, we all need categories, I suppose, to try to put the people that we know or the people we read into. We need these categories, and maybe we shouldn't rely on them, but we tend to. And so I would tend to think that the term functionalism is something that we could probably get rid of. We could stop using, and we wouldn't miss it if we'd stop using it.
I think the reason why we wanted to do this episode is, as I think Daniel talked about in the beginning, before we started recording, maybe there's this perception that there's a war going on, but you get sort of called into the troops without having a basis of like what the conflict is, or if the conflict is about something that concerns you, which like it isn't always, honestly.
I mean, there's obviously sociological reasons for this. I think I mean, it's quite interesting if you talk to kind of older linguists who maybe were students of Chomsky and then ended up disagreeing with him. Those people are often quite open-minded about the generativist functionalist kind of divide. But actually sometimes I find, like when you talk to younger people, some of the older people's anti-generativism has solidified in some younger people, and it's totally gone away in other ones, right? So like that is so it's quite, so then you get these like sociological groupings of people, some people who are like, yeah, I don't really care about this stuff, or I think they were more or less saying the same thing, just about different stuff. And other people are like saying, no, functionalists have no idea what they're doing, or no, generativists have no idea what they're doing. So we get, and then those are the loud people, right? Usually.
Yeah.
Right? So, I think that, we should do as much as we can to encourage there to be conversation, not conflict. I think that's obviously the way that you want to go with these things. And I really, I always think it's really important to read across different research ideas, right? So there's people always have really good ideas in all sorts of different frameworks that you can just go, oh, and these guys said this, and that's really interesting, and I'm going to take that and incorporate it into my work, and let's see how that will go. And I think that's way better than saying, I will have nothing to do with these people. I noticed this very much when I started to work on sociolinguistics and syntax and their connection. I gave this talk on dialectal variation in Buckie, which is a tiny little fishing village up in the north of Scotland, with my friend Jen Smith, who is from there, and she's a big figure in sociolinguistics and works on that stuff. And I remember we gave this stuff a long time ago, back in 2003 or something like that, at a variationist conference, and someone turned to one of Jen's students in the audience and said, "This is dangerous stuff." And of course, the student then told Jen, right? And that was because it was pooling together sociolinguistics and formal minimalist syntax in an attempt to see how they could talk to each other, and they didn't like that, right? And it's always good to do dangerous stuff, I think, right?
We have one final question to you, and that's you've been partaking in the first part of 2 episodes about generativism, and the second part we're going to talk to, I hope I don't offend you by saying more younger, more newly graduated students who are also thinking about these issues, but from sort of the next generation, so to speak. And I was wondering if to our listeners or to them, there's anything you wanted to say about the sort of the legacy of generative theories or these discussions that you think is really important for the next generation, so to speak.
I'd actually like to generalize that question a little bit, because you sent me some questions ahead of time, and you put the question in a more slightly more general context about like the flow of information from one generation to another. So the question you asked me just now has to do with or the way I'm interpreting it is, what's something important that the next generation should be certain not to miss out on, or to forget, or not to capture. And I think, I could try to give you an answer to that, but I'm actually more interested in the larger question, which is, how does it happen that knowledge and wisdom fails to be passed from generation to generation? And I think that this is an enormous phenomenon in disciplines, especially in the social sciences and especially outside the natural sciences, but perhaps even including them to a lesser degree. I think in linguistics, it's a tremendous problem. So I've been rereading actually, but some work from the 1950s on phonology, because I'm writing about it now. And I'm struck once again by how generative grammarians, generative phonologists in particular, had to rediscover, to some extent on their own, things that were published by famous people in important venues during the 1940s and 50s. Just publishing something isn't good enough. We need better ways of making it easy for the next generation, so to speak, to not to forget what preceding generations have learned. And to some degree, this book that I published that you mentioned at the beginning of our Battle in the Minefields is an attempt to encourage younger linguists to do exactly that. We don't set down a curriculum of what it is that you're supposed to learn, but we make the case that this is something that's important for the discipline, that we need to stop forgetting what it is that we've already learned. So what is it important? What's the most important thing for generativism to make sure the next generation hasn't forgotten? That's a difficult question. Richard Feynman said that if there was one thing that he wanted the next civilization not to forget, and that would be that all matter is made out of these little things we call atoms. And I would say that the most important thing is to recognize that a formal account, a mathematical account of language has to be borne in mind. A computational model is important. It may not be the whole truth, but it's an important part of the truth. But just trying to boil it down to a single sentence, that can't be enough. We need to make it easy. We need to make it possible and easy for all generations to have access to what we think of as the most important conclusions of our generation, because there are strong social and psychological reasons for people to reject the work of their teacher's generation, and sometimes their grand teachers, so to speak, going back 2 generations. But this is one of the themes of Battle in the Minefields. The fact that there are perfectly valid reasons for challenging what earlier linguists have said. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but one of the consequences of that is sort of poo-pooing and not paying attention to the important points that they were making. I'll give one example. You can edit this out. When Paul Kiparsky created lexical phonology, along with some other people, but I'd give most of the credit to him in the early 1980s, what he was doing was taking Harris's theory of phonology and morphophonology and reconstructing it in a generative context. I asked him about that at one point, and he said, I never thought of it that way. But it's exactly what he was doing. And it was the right thing to do. I would have been happier if he had said, oh, yeah, of course that's what I was doing. I'm glad you noticed. But generative grammar, or rather generative phonology, threw out that difference. It rejected it, the difference between phonology and morphophonology. But it had to be brought back in, and it was brought back in, but not in a conscious and intellectually rich, articulated way. So that's the best answer I can give you.
I feel like now you guys are unfortunately sort of in a little bit of the same boat that physicists are still in with gravity, right? They're not there yet with figuring out truly, properly what it is that forms that force. And similarly, there's no, you can't bust open a cell and be like, yay, generativism, we found it.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Ben. And you said unfortunately. I kind of think of that as fortunately, right? There's a lot of work still to do. I think that
still in the fuck around phase, so fuck around and find out.
I mean, more or less. I definitely feel that a great deal of the work in generative syntax, let's say, which is what I know most about, over the last decades, has been kind of a bit like chemists in the 18th century or whatever, like kind of just trying to figure out what the stuff is, right? What the big molecules are, in a sense. So what are the things that are around there? And there's not been so much work. I mean, Chomsky does this, and a number of other people do this. There's not been so much work in trying to get down to those primitives. So people, a lot of people just take the theory off the shelf and go, okay, this one will do, and then you kind of build up you kind of like say, how does this explain the generalizations we've got? So we're absolutely nowhere near it yet, and there's a big, big problem, which is that we don't really understand how knowledge maps to cellular structure in the brain, right? In any domain, never mind just linguistics. We really have very little understanding of how, how does the fact that I'm having a complex thought about linguistic theory, what the hell is that in my neural structure? We don't know anything like that, right? I mean, so, and we probably will, I don't know if we ever will, but,
we're basically at the stage of being able to go, oh, look, some pretty lights. That's
exactly where we're at. And there is some interesting stuff in the pretty lights. So, but I don't know how much. I mean, there are a lot of people who know a lot more about neurology, the physiology of neurons, and how they map to memory and knowledge structure than I do. But, there's certain things, I don't know, we don't know, how to explain why we do any of the things we do, right? Like why we say what we want to say. We don't know why I saw a caterpillar in my walk yesterday, and it was kind of like walking the direction it was walking, and then it went round a leaf. I'm like, we don't have the neurological understanding to know why that happens, right? Even something as simple as that. So maybe we could if we could MRI a caterpillar. I don't know. I think that there is a gap. There's absolutely a gap. I don't think it will never be bridged. I don't know if it will be bridged, soon, but one can hope.
We've been talking to Professor David Adger of Queen Mary University and Professor John Goldsmith of the University of Chicago. Okay, that was a lot of terrain to cover.
We've done a lot.
Yeah. I'm glad our listeners was with us for that ride. I thought that was really revealing, and we learned a lot of interesting things.
I told you to sharpen your pencils. Don't say you weren't warned. You were warned. I warned you.
Do you get the impression that generativism is fading a bit, or is it as strong as ever?
I think maybe it is diversifying and becoming a bit blurred at the edges. I think that there are many different types of generativists, and that they're not a monolith. Mm-hmm. And I think this happens with any good academic field or research question. It's very sharply defined. at its onset, and then it becomes more blurry and blurry as it starts interacting with neighboring disciplines, and it's usually a good thing. It usually generates better research.
Yeah, cross-pollination is great. You don't want to have a discipline that's completely insular.
Yeah, exactly.
The vibe I get is that it's just kind of quite old as a concept, you know, like it's been around for a really long time now, and a lot of different people have taken some stuff from it, but then not other stuff from it, and it's just kind of I don't like. It certainly isn't irrelevant, but it's kind of like a grandfatherly type school of thought that has influenced a lot of things and has generated a lot of discussion, and it's not irrelevant, and it's still important to know about and to think about, but at the same time, like, sort of the vibe that I personally get is that some people are just kind of like, yeah, it's a thing, but like, I want to talk about this other stuff now. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Including some generativists, maybe even.
Yeah, exactly. Like some of the, like our guests sometimes were kind of like, yeah, I mean, I guess, but also look at this other cool stuff.
My impression is that it might have faded already, except that Chomsky has been such an incredibly capable and omnipresent force keeping it moving along.
I mean, look, the dude is, without question, a towering intellect. And I think that some of his non-linguistic stuff, in fact, a lot of his non-linguistic stuff has probably fed back into, like, how do you come at a Chomsky? Honestly, like, he is just such a enormously smart and influential dude that his weight, his gravity, I think, has probably kept things going sort of due to its own power a little bit.
Well, there's something that I would teach my linguistics students. I would bring up the concept of the analytical knife, and this comes from Robert Pirsig's book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which maybe nobody reads anymore. Maybe it's no good. Maybe I was impressed way too much by it when I was younger. But
it was clearly a book that impressed a lot of people a lot. I think that's
yes.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, but that could be because I'm just a basic bitch. But anyway.
You should own that. You should stand in your truth.
It's fine. It's fine. Like, I really like the first, 5 seasons of Modern Family. It's hilarious. It's genuinely a really funny show. And yes, is it, incredibly popular in mainstream? Is it still funny? Absolutely.
Okay.
Is this when I out that Steve watches a lot of How I Met Your Mother?
Okay.
I would not be comfortable being outed that way, personally. But
Okay. Scratch.
Anyway, what I would tell my students is about a concept called the analytical knife. Like, the example that I like to use is if you take an apple and you cut it up to down, perpendicular to the table, that'll show you something about the structure of the apple. But if you take that apple and slice it parallel to the table, like across, you'll see a lovely star pattern in the seeds. So...
Right. In one you see the core, or the structure of the core, and the other you see the structure of the star.
Yeah, the way that we use the analytical knife influences the kind of things that we see. And I told them in my units, which were more generative, I would say, this is a generative approach. It will show us some things and it will obscure other things.
Yes.
Now, the question is, though, if I may be so bold, if I may be even a little bit cheeky, is that you being sort of wishy-washy, like academically fence-sitting?
I don't think so. I think that the choices that we make have consequences. So one of the choices that generativists make is syntax is where we are going to do our thing. That is the point that they find very interesting. And if you think that language is internal and syntax is the place to look, then it tells you some things about language, but it also obscures some others. Like, it becomes very difficult to say why language varies and changes. In fact, in our journal club, we saw an article by a generativist who said, well, language doesn't adapt to its environment. Language doesn't change very much in very interesting ways because the environment is the mind and we all have human brains, and language doesn't change very much, at least not in ways that I find very interesting as a generativist.
Yeah.
But if you start with language as communication, then language change and language variation becomes easy to understand. We all have a repertoire, we communicate, we don't communicate entirely faithfully, things change over time, we change our language according to who we want to be, blah, 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 blah. All the functionalist stuff. So what I want to ask here is, if we take a generative approach, are we gaining more than we lose? Is it costing us more than it's worth? You got to look at what we gain from this, and it's not clear to me that the insights that we gain are worth what we lose, but maybe that's because I'm more interested in variation and change and I'm less interested in syntax. And if you made different choices, then you'd be like, hell yeah, this is what I'm into. What do you think?
think that when you only do one thing in academia, you only have one perspective, you always lose a little bit. I've taken some classes by generative teachers and in syntax and been genuinely like in awe of some of the elegant, cool things you can show with that theory.
I just have a mental image of you dressed like an emo while you do it because you're being like a hell rebel to all the people who are like, no, don't do it.
But I mean, I didn't continue down that path because I was interested in questions that I didn't think that enterprise could answer or were interested in about like why languages diversify. I don't think they were interested really in that question in that way. So I think it's good to be multifaceted as a scholar, and I think there are more and more generative scholars who are seeing that need. I don't know if I already flagged that I might bring this up, but there, for example, there was a conference in 2015 called Generative Syntax in 21st Century, The Road Ahead. They had a round table discussion where everyone beforehand submitted little statements about where they thought the field was going. And cool. I noticed that there were several of the people there who said that generativism should become more multidisciplinary and look into other fields more. So, yeah, maybe it's blurring out, but in a good way. Yeah, okay. And that's what we're going to be talking more about in the next episode.
You mean the show, the episode, How It's Going, which will be up soon.
That's right. And remember, there's a lot more to these discussions. So if you are a patron at the listener level, you can hear the full interviews with David Adger and with John Goldsmith. Check us out on patreon.com/becauselangpod. And now we are to our words of the week.
Boo. Sorry. Just old habits die hard.
I'm afraid this one might not be very fun because there's a lot of COVID vocabulary. Like I said, I used to avoid Trump vocabulary, and now I'm avoiding COVID vocabulary.
Yeah, but there's certain things can't be avoided.
Yep. So I'm going to start with one. You tell me what you think this is. Booster bandit.
Oh, I wonder. I'm gonna open with a guess. Is it to do with the reports? I don't know if this is unique to just Australia, but like people taking home doses of vaccine at the end, like nurses and stuff at the end of their shifts that have not been injected, and then like giving them to friends and family. Is it to do with that?
It is not.
Okay.
Hedvig,
Is it somehow stealing a third dose?
Yes.
Okay.
Stealing a third. So you take it upon yourself, sort of as a not medical professional, to be like, I need 3.
Or you fake that you didn't. You say that you didn't have the second one. Somehow.
Yeah, something like that. In a way to secure your third dose.
That's right. I'm reading this from an article in The Atlantic by Rachel Gutman. Booster bandits are walking a fine line. It's true that for some people, a third booster is recommended, maybe because they are immunocompromised, like some cancer patients with a weakened immune system, people over 65. But it seems that the CDC in the USA has counted nearly 1.8 million people who have gotten an additional shot. Maybe because they said that they were immunocompromised so that they could get it.
Yucky.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
How do you fake being immunocompromised?
You could just say that you are.
Oh.
And then, yeah.
I love that Hedvig, as a good, nice person, doesn't understand how lying works.
I just thought that you'd like show like a thing from a doctor saying like, look at my low blah blah count.
Mm-hmm.
No. Okay, interesting.
Gutman also says, this is a quote, there's also virtually no way to know how many reported first doses are actually illegitimate third shots. End of quote. Right. Yeah, it's a bit ethically sketchy to get a third one when you don't need it, especially when people in developing nations have a hard time getting any at all. Yeah. So, at this stage, it's recommended for some people, but not for all. So don't be a booster. I think the word bandit is a really interesting choice here.
Well, I mean, clearly they've gone for alliteration here. Like, they were like, what thief word starts with B? Sounds super boomery, I gotta be honest. It sounds like the sort of thing that, like, over 55 say.
Oh, okay.
Maybe.
Am I the only person who's getting that vibe? Really? Really?
No.
That doesn't sound like...
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
Now, Thomas, don't be a booster bandit.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I get it. Okay, next one. We all know that anti-vaxxers are dangerous and gross,
Fact.
but now they've taken it to a whole new level. And I noticed this in a tweet from Jack Lynch at JackLynch000, who says, so the anti-vaxxers are rebranding and apparently ask themselves, how can we convey all the paranoia of traditional anti-vax conspiracy theorists, but throw in a hint of white supremacy too?
Oh, no.
I know.
That's not what that movement needs.
I know what this
Here
is.
it is.
This is worse. Yeah.
Go on.
It's pure-blooded.
Yes, thank you.
What?
Pure-blooded.
Yes, I saw it on
So-
Twitter as well.
Wait, does this mean that you are a good white person or a good unvaccinated person?
Both.
Or does it mean both?
Potentially. It means that you believe that you are strong enough to defeat this virus without having any vaccines.
Oh,
Bad news.
oh, this is oh, this
Yeah,
is gross.
that's pretty gross.
You haven't been tainted with the vaccine, which... do these people just not get vaccines at all? I imagine some of them don't.
Wait, are
I
you
mean,
asking
it
if
is-
anti-vaxxers don't get vaccines?
No,
I think
I'm-
that's
Like,
right
I
there in the
understand
title.
that.
But have they never? Are they imagining that there's this group
sorry.
of people who have never gotten any vaccines at all? So let me just read some of the tweets. I'm hashtag pure-blooded and I feel amazing. My immune system is strong. I'm a real hashtag human being. Another person rather worryingly tweets, and these tweets are still up as of this morning, it is time for the hashtag pure-blooded, the anti-vax, to start their own economies, come together to build their own schools, banks, factories, and etc.
Oh my!
Yeah.
Wow, that is.
I listen to, I'm a big fan of as I've talked before on this show, the QAnon Anonymous podcast, and they cover a lot
yeah.
of this kind of stuff. And there's a weird overlap between anti-vaxxers, QAnon people, and hippy-dippy crystal healing people, and, lo and behold, crypto people.
Oh, gross.
Because they believe that they need to build a new currency for their new world.
Do you know what I find particularly noxious about this part of this story is that this notion of like we need to build like our own economies and we need to have our own schools and facilities and stuff. That is just like ruthlessly appropriated from many people in sort of like disenfranchised communities, right? So like this is a talking point that you'll hear a lot of black activists talk about, right? We need to keep to use their language, the black dollar in our communities for much longer. We need to like all this kind of stuff. And it is a super valid argument. It's a really, really good and important thing that disenfranchised people, indigenous people, black people, people of color absolutely should be looking at and doing. And then, as with all things, the whiteys come along and they're just like, I really like this language you're using. It seems to work quite well for you. I'ma steal it.
It doesn't even necessarily have to be expropriated from the black community. I mean, the language of the white ethno-state is exactly this kind of thing. You know, we need to have our own sort of area with everybody else shipped out of it. It ties in pretty well to the white supremacy narrative. Pretty gross.
Super gross.
So that's out there. But now here's a nice one. And this one comes to us from Matthew via email, who says, apologies if you've already had this word on the podcast. I can't catch every minute of every episode, but I do try ever since I started listening a few months ago. The question is, what do you call somebody who's had a mix and match of vaccines? Maybe you got one Pfizer and one Moderna, one of
that's
one and one of somebody
fun.
else. Yeah, what do you call it?
What would you call it? Would you call it shake and bake? No. Would you call it a
Mix and match.
a pick and mix?
Pick and mix.
Pick and mix is good. Pick
reminds
and
me- yeah.
vax.
Yeah, pick and vax. Vax and mix.
That sounds like chicken pox. Pick and max. Pox and
okay.
max.
The term that Michael alerted us to, bivaxual.
I don't
that's
know
cute.
if I like that.
What do you reckon?
I don't like the you all. I always struggle
Bivax. You
bivaxed. Bivaxed, I would do
Bivaxed.
instead.
I like that. That's fun.
Yeah.
And you would have
bivaxed.
two X's, which according to convention is the way
Yeah.
that goes.
Bivaxed. Yeah.
Okay.
But bivactual is also fun. Yeah.
Hedvig, you have another one?
Yeah, I have sort of two, and one of them none of you are going to get, but you can do your best guesses, and the first one I think
I'm
you're going to
ready.
get. Ballgate and Ballygate.
Can you spell the second one for me, just so I know I'm understanding?
Bali gate.
Okay, so the place, Bali.
No.
Oh, okay.
Golly.
You're never going to get this one, but you can. No,
Okay.
I mean, I could just say it's a person name in Sweden, so it's not.
Okay. So the first one I think is the safe bet. It's something to do with the Met Gala, because every year when the Met Gala happens, people who don't have enough words in their bloody news stories just use it. They just like, oh, look, the Met Gala. I can write stories about that.
It's not to do with the Met Gala, though. I considered having peg and some other terms from there on here, but no. Ballgate is to do. Daniel, do you know?
The only thing I can think of is Deflategate, which was when a certain sports ball match had slightly deflated balls, which gave one team an advantage. The gate clearly suggests some kind of scandal.
Gate is a suffix we know, thanks to good old Richie Nix. Everything that is bad ends in gate.
So
all right, but I'm out.
You're out. Ballgate is to do with Nicki Minaj.
Okay.
She
hang
tweeted. What did she tweet?
It was something obnoxious about. God, why have I forgotten this?
She said, and I'm going to get this.
Nicki Minaj.
I'm going to paraphrase. I'm going to get this maybe slightly wrong, but she said that her cousin's friend or her friend's cousin, either way, someone a few distance removed from her had gotten the vaccine, and that his testicles had gotten very swollen, and she was sort of suggesting that the vaccine had caused this. Since then, the White House in the United States of America has reached out to Miss Minaj and discussed with her
options for not saying that.
Offered her to talk to a doctor about how vaccines work. And it was just fun to me that this
Why
word...
should she get a private tutorial? Oh my God.
Apparently this is the thing they do. On the press conference, the White House spokesperson said that they do this with other influencers as well. And Ballygate is just in Sweden. There's a politician called Hanif Bali who regularly gets into hot water on a number of different issues. And I actually, when I Googled Ballygate, I found out that he just often says obnoxious, horrible things. So he frequently, the Ballygate refers to about like 3 different events, but the most recent...
So he's Sweden's like Trump or whatever. Like he's just a person who just is making a brand out of saying just obnoxiously
He's their Clive Palmer. Did you, by the way, Ben, did you get a random text from Clive Palmer's party saying...
I did not.
Oh, God. I got 2 saying... Free people and make sure the vaccine isn't given to anyone.
Today?
It was like last week.
Oh, okay, because there was a big march. There was like a freedom rally, stupid idiots doing a thing in the city today while I was in the city, so I thought that might have something to do with it. Anyway, not relevant.
Sorry, Hedvig, what is it?
No, it's just he's under investigation for pressuring young girls to pose for him sexually.
Oh, good.
Oh,
is one of the latest things. I should say it's in an investigation, so he's not found guilty yet, but that is what currently Ballygate is referring to. But as other Swedish people who listen to this podcast will know, Ballygate refers to a number of different things. But I just thought it was quite funny that both these words were in my newsfeed at the same time, so Ballgate and Ballygate.
I like that your 2 words are only being shared because there is like a a geographical similarity.
Yeah.
And just so that I don't misunderstand, the Ballgate thing, people are worried that the vaccine will swell their testicles?
Based on Nicki Minaj's mate's cousin's friend, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a reverse Koro, where people thought that their penises were shrinking into their bodies by witchcraft. Am I right?
Yeah, but I don't think this is, like, you don't increase your potency by having swollen balls.
No, of course not. They're because you just have these enormous, useless testicles just swinging around.
Yeah. Melons. Pant melons.
Oh, God. We should say this vaccines don't cause your testicles to swell. I think our listeners know better than that.
100% not a thing. I am double vaccinated. My testicles didn't swell. Daniel?
Mine are just the same size as they always have been. But that's an N of 2, so, you know.
Oh, my God.
Thank you for that. Those 2 are great. So, Booster Bandits, pure-blooded, bivax or bivactual, Ballgate and Ballygate are words of the week.
You see why I hate this segment? You see? Do you see?
It's all a put on.
You hate this segment because it is the most newsy segment, and we live in late stage capitalism, and everything's horrible. That's why.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
Loves
That is actually a really that's
It's
quite
like-
insightful.
It's like you don't hate Mondays, you hate capitalism. It's that thing.
I haven't seen that meme, but that's good. I like that.
Yeah.
Ben, you don't hate word of the week. You hate capitalism.
Yeah.
That is true. I do.
I think that is true. Anyway, if you don't hate capitalism or hate it, you can get in touch with us. But we should say we are not political scientists. We are a language and linguistics show. So if you want to question or comment or just say hi to us, you can get in touch with us in all the places where we are. We are Because LangPod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Mastodon, Patreon, TikTok, Clubhouse, and Substack. If you are not on any of those social media platforms, probably good for you. Congratulations. You have other things to do with your life, but maybe you have an email. You can send us an email at hello@becauselanguage.com. And if you like our show, if you like our bantering and our generativism and all the things that are us, we would be really, really grateful if you told a friend about us. Maybe your aunt, who always gives you those like etymology books or clippings. Because you said one time you were interested in language.
Do you have an aunt who does that?
Yeah, of course I do.
Unfortunately. Yeah, it's like that thing where, like, when you're 8 years old, you say you really like frogs, and then it's like nothing but frog presents from that one grandma.
I get you.
And it's like anything to do with language. It's very lovely. No, I like it. I am very grateful for my aunts. And it does show that they care. So I'm just saying that if you have an aunt like that and she's showing that kind of interest in you, tell her about our show. Maybe she'll like it. You can also do like Dustin of Salmon Stories and recommend us anytime anyone asks podcast recommendations on Twitter. I'm continued to being amazed by the bravery of people who do this because people on Twitter love podcasts. And another great way you can help the show is by leaving us a review in all the places where you can leave a review. I would highly recommend that even if you don't really use iTunes, log on to it just once, just for us. Log on to it once and leave a review. It is, unfortunately, one of the main places where podcast reviews matter. Doing all of those things will help people find us.
I know, it's really unfortunate and annoying, I have to say. I'm very resentful of iTunes' bizarrely influential thing on podcasts, because it's not the primary place that people listen to podcasts. Like, by any stretch of the imagination. It's a significant player, no question. I'm not like saying it's not. But yeah, it's their reviews being the reviews that people care about. That was weird.
Yeah, I mean, they also
But it is a thing, so please go and do it for us.
Please do it. And we did have someone do it for us, Moen Radio via Apple Podcast, from the location of Japan, unless it was a VPN, gave us a 5-star review and said, best place to satisfy my linguistics brain. So thank you so much for that, Moen Radio.
Thank you. That's so lovely. Hey, friends, compatriots, but not patrons. Patrons, you can just tune out for the minute because you know what's coming. But everyone who isn't a patron, but who is a friend and compatriot, perhaps you would like to consider becoming a patron, because by becoming a patron, you allow us, through giving us money, to do heaps of really cool stuff that isn't really about us. Like, we don't, contain your surprise, we don't personally, individually make a lot of money from this show, but we do, with your money, do lots of cool things, such as making these episodes without annoying ads, making transcripts thanks to the work of Maya Klein of Voicing Words. Hey Maya, I hope you have once again had a as not terrible time as possible trying to transmogrify my awful voice into words. Because of Maya's wonderful work at Voicing Words, our shows are accessible to people who can't listen or just don't want to, and it also has the sideline benefit of being searchable. Now, the patrons who help make this possible are Dustin, Termy, Chris B, Chris L, Matt, Whitney, Damien, Helen, Bob, Udo, Jack, Kitty, Lord Mortis, Elias, Michael, Larry, Christopher, Andy, Mai, James, Nigel, Kate, Jen, Nazrin, River, Nikolai, Aisha, Moe, Steele, Andrew, Manu, James, Roger, Rianne, Jonathan, Colleen, Glyph, Ignacio, Kevin, Jeff, Dave H, Andy from Logophilius, and most recently, Samantha, Zoe, Kathy, Rosh, and the legendary Kate B. Made it. Thanks to all our patrons for your support.
Nice going. Our theme music has been written and performed by Drew Kruplianov, who is a member of Ryan Bino and of Didion's Bible. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time. Because language.
Aww, good show, everyone.
Pat on back.
It's a wild and beautiful sight. Everybody's dancing in the moonlight. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Hey, what are we doing for the mail out? We were talking about the condoms. Ben Ainsley double thumbs up condoms.
Oh my god.
I can't even remember making that joke, but I regret it immensely.
Yeah,
we're not
I
doing
regret
that.
it, and I haven't made it.
Okay. We were talking. Of course, stickers are a thing, but there's also, we could go large. We could go pencils. We could go.
We can go large. We can go pencils. I love
Well, that's about as large as I can go, actually. Because
Shipping constraints. I like it. But yeah, for a second I was just like, oh wow, that's some real like Mormon baggage coming through. Like we could go really extravagant, guys, and get pencils.
Lash out on pens. Yeah.
I should say, recently I went to Sweden to dig out a bunch of my old stuff that I left there years and years and years ago. And I did find that I'd totally forgotten about that I was like the president of the student council in my high school. And
you were the head girl. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know what head girl means.
Like
or valedictorian.
you were the student president.
Yeah, for my secondary school.
That absolutely tracks.
That
I don't know about you, Daniel, but
surprise
like
anyone.
now I'm just like, oh my god, of course you were.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise anyone.
This gives me an idea. Should we do it for the postcard this year? Should we do old school photos?
Oh, can we please get Hedvig in her full ceremonial regalia from high school? That would be so good.
Like, no one has robes. There's nothing like that. We don't do graduation. It's not well, we do graduation. But anyway, what I was going to say was I was the chairman of the student council in my secondary school, and we had a campaign for some reason about safe sex, and we did print out customized condoms that we did a little rain off. I was on stage, and then we threw a lot of condoms at students. That's pretty fun.
Please tell me there is a photo of you throwing condoms off a stage as a teenager.
At high school.
Please.
No,
please.
but I have a condom. Like, what I found among my things was an unopened little one with the little customized text on it. And I was kind of pleased.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, I'm pleased about myself.
Don't use it.
No. I'm going to save it for forever.
I thought you were about to I'm going to save it for a special occasion. Like a time I really, really specially don't want to get pregnant.
No, a time when you really don't care about the safety of it or not, because...
Oh, no, it's very old.
Horrendously expired.
Yeah, old.
Yeah, it's probably expired, for sure. I scratched my screen the other week, and I went to a phone repairman and said, I need to replace the screen of my phone. And he was like, are you sure it's not the screen protector? And I was like, I'm not. And he pulled off the screen protector and turned out it was. And I felt very silly, but, glad to not have to replace it. And he was like, I'll put on a new one for you. But the new one he put on is a bit better, so it's a bit thicker. So I have to press a bit harder to get anything done.
Oh, that's fascinating. I've never encountered that with a screen protector. Having said that, I've never used a phone without a screen protector. So I wonder if I just peeled this bad boy off, if I would just be like a person trying to shave with an axe, you know what I mean? Like I would just be this fat-fingered pleb who's just been bashing away for his entire life.
Well, Hedvig, why don't you just scratch it again and then peel it off?
So I threw my phone on the ground during a walk about 2 months ago. Totally smashed the front of it. Got a new replacement screen for too much money, and now it's overly sensitive. I have to turn it backwards inside my pocket, or else it it does stuff. It randomly turns off Bluetooth, or turns me into flight mode.
Oh, no.
It's infuriating.
It's like a raw nerve exposed
it's exactly
and ready.
Like a raw nerve exposed. Yeah.
Well, I've always been a nude phoner, and I dropped it, but I cracked the back. So
you are I genuinely cannot fathom your tribe. People who have phones unprotected in any way. Honestly,
I used to do that for the longest time.
I just can't. To me, you are just people who are members of swingers communities, just having unprotected sex constantly. I cannot possibly imagine
each
that.
their own, I should say.
It is a bit like that, but I figure I'm out for kicks. I'm here for a good time, not for a long time, and I'm up to no good.
Oh my God. Either that or you guys are just, and this I think is actually the far more likely explanation, far more careful people than I am. I just, phones die.
I was biking home last night from a social gathering. I was at a social gathering in a park.
Wow. Being outside.
Like being outside, talking to people, I made a new friend. She's called Alexis. She's very nice.
I love the way your voice is almost cracking there when you say the words. I made a new friend.
Dad, I can't believe it.
It was amazing. And then when I biked home, I had these like bad pockets, and I was listening to a podcast, and suddenly the podcast stopped, and I heard a slam, and it was because my phone just went down into the street with a great force.
So as a fellow cyclist, and I promise we'll start doing a show soon, I swear.
Yeah, jeez. We got enough B-roll.
I have lost many phones to the exact scenario that you've just described, like over the years. But what I've noticed though, and this might happen for you as well, the name and the episode of the podcast I was listening to for all of those instances is indelibly burned into my brain now.
Oh,
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's
some
kind of trauma in your neural system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a bad Pavlov bell ringing type thing.
So my phone was totally fine.
Oh, that's pretty great.
Lucky.
Yeah, it didn't. The screen protector wasn't even scratched. I don't know why. I don't know why. By what sort of grace of whatever deity I managed to pull that off, but it was totally fine. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the big guy was just checking you out, being like, you know what? It's her first party since all this. I'm not gonna. It's just not right.
Yeah,
I'm gonna give you a
it's
pass.
Very nice.
The DM of your life basically just took pity on you.
Yeah, probably.
Or you just had a great saving throw.